All right, today it's a fairly simple topic, looking at Australia's grains industry and in particular focusing on where does Australian grain go, and also talking about the way in which grain is exported in Australia. Last year was a record production year for Australia, 62 million metric tonnes. Normally Australia produces around about 45 million metric tonnes of grain. So last year at 62 million metric tonnes was a record. This year we're also on track to produce a very large crop. Western Australia, the most recent forecasts as of yesterday from the Grains Industry Association of Western Australia puts this year's West Australian crop at 20 million metric tonnes, and Australia-wide we're probably going to be producing over 50 million metric tonnes, maybe between 50 and 55 million metric tonnes. That's a very large grain harvest. It's equivalent here to 1.6 million truckloads of grain. So a huge, and that means because we are currently producing so much grain, Australia's ability to export is currently very favourable. If you look at Australia's winter cropping area and the history, bearing in mind that Australia does produce summer and winter crops, but Australian grain production is dominated by its winter crops. That's crops like wheat, barley, canola. About only 7% of the national's crop production comes from summer cropping. The winter crop area has greatly increased during the 90s when there was a swing away from sheep production into grain production. Farming systems switched towards being more crop dominant. However, in the last 20 years, the crop area in Australia has plateaued. Very little change in the winter cropping area. Farming systems that switched and moved into crop dominance have stayed in that plateau state of being crop dominant. Despite the plateauing of the area committed to grain production, winter wheat crop yields have continued an upward trajectory despite the impact of a variable climate. Plant scientists, farmers, technologists have managed to find ways to improve what's known as water use efficiency, and we observe an annual rate of increase in Australian crop yields of about 0.9% per annum. When you combine that yield increase with the area allocated to grains, we remain on an upward trajectory with respect to crop production. As I said, last year we produced 62 million metric tonnes. This year we will be well over 50. The fact that we are on an upward trajectory of grain production means that Australia has an ability to be a global exporter. It also means that the grains industry plays an increasingly important economic role with respect to its economic contribution into the national economy. The export revenue is of particular importance. One of the features of the grains industry in recent years has been the very unusual coalescing of high grain prices with high yields. Often in farming, you tend to experience either high yields occasionally or high prices occasionally, but rarely do you get that twin event of high prices and high yields, but that's been experienced in the last couple of years. When it comes to where does Australian grain grow, the biggest grain market for Australian grain is actually Australia. Most people have a view of Australia as an internationally important grain exporter. While that's true, the main market for Australian grain is within Australia, and most grain is not used for direct human consumption. Most grain is actually fed to animals in Australia. Each year we deliver about 18 million metric tonnes of grain into the domestic market, of which about 14 million is fed to a variety of animals. I think I might have said in previous presentations how Australia's meat consumption has shifted. If you went back 20, 30 years ago, the main meats consumed in Australia were beef and lamb, whereas now the main meats that are consumed are chicken and pork, and the least consumed meat now is lamb. Why I mention that is the fact that the main meats that are consumed in Australia, that is chicken and pork, are underpinned by grain feeding. That has ramifications for the use of grain in Australia. People's diets have switched away from dependence on extensively grazed animals such as beef or sheep towards reliance on consuming chicken and pork. People consume chicken and pork because they are the most affordable meats. And that's unlikely to change. So in coming years, there will be a continued emphasis on consuming meats like chicken and pork. Because we have maintained an upward trajectory of grain production, and because of the way in which we use grain domestically, it means that there is a surplus of grain available to export. If you just do the sum in your head, that if we are consuming 18 million metric tonnes on the domestic market, and we produce around about 50 million metric tonnes annually, then that difference of 32 million metric tonnes is the surplus that's available to export. So although Australia as a country is the main destination for grain grown in Australia, the relative proportion of grain that is exported versus allocated domestically is greater. That is, the international market compared to the domestic market is relatively more important, in as much as more grain goes onto the international scene than goes onto the domestic scene, even though country by country, Australia ranks first as the destination of grain. I want to now unpick the grain production story and consider some important spatial changes that have been occurring in grain demand and supply, and why that actually matters going forward. The first thing to note are just some demand basics, that Australia's population is growing at 1.3% per annum. And remember that our grain area has plateaued, so any increase in production is dependent on grain yield increases, which at the moment are only 0.9% per annum. When you look at the combination of Australia's growth in population, the way in which grains are consumed, and then you overlay the way in which grain production levels are continuing to increase, and you can build a simple demand and supply model, which I've done here, and then you project what are the implications for exports. You find that nationally, exports of grain from Australia remain on an upward trajectory. So despite population growth, despite the way in which dietary behaviour causes people to have an increased reliance on grain fed to animals, the fact that we are able to continuously improve our yields of grain, and because of the large area over which grain is grown, means that the export trajectory remains positive and upwards. But then if you consider that 80% of Australia's population resides in Eastern Australia, and importantly overlay grain production with the incidence of drought, and it's known that drought is more prevalent in Eastern Australia. They have a greater probability of consecutive droughts. You may be aware that there was a phrase coined the Millennium Drought, which described a period of several years of widespread drought in Eastern Australia. Consecutive years of drought are very rare in Western Australia. There are some regions that have experienced consecutive droughts, such as the north-eastern grain belt of Western Australia, which experienced consecutive droughts in 2006 and 2007. We've had widespread drought across Western Australia in 2010, but consecutive severe drought is very rare in Western Australia, but it's not rare in Eastern Australia. The other point to note is that there's 80% of Australia's extensively grazed animals are in Eastern Australia. And whenever there is a drought, those extensively grazed animals increase their demand for fodder and feed. For animal welfare reasons, those animals need to be fed. And given the value of animals, it's often lucrative to do so. That is to maintain those animals rather than to